So what we want to do now, we're going to talk about the words of Kohelet. That's what I'm going to just. That's what we're going to use. That's the transliteration where you just pronounce the Hebrew word. That's the phrase when the words of the preacher, Davar Kohelet. That's the phrase describing this man. There's discussion about what's the best way to translate that. ESV's translation of the preacher is not a bad translation because Kohelet is from. It's derived from the noun that is used especially in the Torah, to describe the assembly or the congregation of Israel. The Kahal Yisrael. That's the assembly of Israel. I'm tempted to write the Hebrew up there, but that'll sidetrack us and we'll never finish Ecclesiastes if we go down that road. But the title is drawn from that word that describes the gathering of the people of God. So the footnote to ESV says the convener or the collector, the assembler, the one who brings the people of God together in the assembly of the Lord or the congregation of the Lord. So because of that, the ESV says it's almost a function like a preacher, what he's doing. He is addressing the gathered people of God. So that's not a bad translation. The one downside is that we're not meant to read Ecclesiastes as an actual sermon, in the way that, for instance, the book of Hebrews is actually a sermon. It's a sermon in written form, but it's like we're reading whoever the author's sermon manuscript is, that at some point was proclaimed to a congregation. Ecclesiastes isn't like that. So if when we read the preacher, we picture someone in a pulpit preaching this, we'll be slightly off base. I think it's better just to go with the phrase in Hebrew. It's an easy sound, Kohelet. You'll see it spelled different ways depending on how it's translated into English. But that's who we're going to talk about. So when I say Kohelet says, that's what I mean. That's the words of the writer of this book. With this exception, look at that outline up there. So there's a prologue, 1 through 11. There's the main body, 1:12 through 12:7, and then there's an epilogue. And what distinguishes those is the transition from speaking of Kohelet in the third person, the preacher, or Kohelet, the king of Israel, and him speaking in the first person, I, the preacher. You see that in 1:12. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. Most of the book is going to be him speaking directly. I have seen, I thought, I pondered, I set my heart. The beginning and the end talk about him in the third person. And the question is raised in the commentaries, is this someone else adding a beginning and an ending to Kohelet's words? Is it Kohelet describing himself, speaking in the third person? And is the message of the prologue and the epilogue in agreement with what Kohelet says, or is it contradicting it? As we see when we get to the end, there's going to be one reading, which I think misses the point entirely, but you'll find it in the commentaries, that says that the final words in the epilogue, which is 12 through 14, say, okay, we've let Kohelet have his word, but what he says is actually wrong. It's skeptical. It's the wrong way of thinking about the task of wisdom. So let me now tell you in 6 verses how you should respond to this book. I think that misses much of the power of the book, and it's a unified message. But that you will encounter that if you read commentaries. I get very frustrated with commentaries when they say that because I don't think they're reading the book rightly. But that's at least out there. So we've got, what I want you to take away, we've got a main body where Kohelet is speaking in the first person, and then we have a beginning and an ending, before and after that, speaking about him in the third person. I can't definitively answer the question, who's writing that beginning and ending, and I don't think we need to. We just want to note, by reading carefully the text, we want to note that there's a slight change in the speaker, or in the way it's spoken. We have the words of the preacher, and then we have the preacher telling us in first person, I saw this, and then a transition back to commending the preacher and saying, or Kohelet, saying, the words of Kohelet are ended, that sort of thing. So that's going to make us pay attention to the text. Now, I won't read the quote, but one of the commentators on this says, it is impossible to come up with a structure for Ecclesiastes. And then, ever since then, people have been trying to come up with structures for Ecclesiastes, and nobody agrees on the exact structure for how we work our way through this book. But, next page, let me show you. There's one scholar who I think is on the right track by noting that in the body, after we get through this opening section that we're going to look at, there's an alteration between observations where Kohelet says, I saw, or I thought, I set my heart to consider. And then places where he gives instructions, where he speaks with commands, and he tells us how to think about what he's observed. And if you pay attention to that, there's a back and forth between observation and instruction throughout the book. So what I have here is an outline using this particular scholar. His name is Stephen de Jong. I think it's Stephen. Yeah, Stefan de Jong. I think he's from Brazil. This is his outline. We're going to see that it tracks pretty well with the text. There are places where the boundaries, like when have we moved from observing something to giving instructions, where that's not quite clear. But in general, paying attention to that, when is Kohelet saying, I saw, I observed, I thought about this, and when is he telling us directly with commands that we need to obey? Do this, don't do this. That kind of back and forth is going to be a good way to work our way through the book. So with that in mind, let's work our way through Ecclesiastes. And I think if we can do this for the rest of the day and maybe begin to talk about Christ-centered applications, we'll be in a good spot to finish up what we need to tomorrow. So it begins with a superscription, kind of like the Psalms. It's telling us the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And then we have what most commentators recognize is the motto or the theme of Ecclesiastes. Verse 2, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities. All is vanities. The word there, it's an important word. The word is hevel or hebel. It's the hey, bait, and lamed in Hebrew. And the B, the middle phrase, I don't know if Amharic has a similar sound. It's depending on how the pronunciation is, it can be a B or a V sound, whether it has a little dot. If it looks like this is bait, that is a V sound. If it has this dot in it called a dagesh, it has a B sound. So it's written, you'll see it written in there in English because it's the B letter, it's hebel. But in context, it doesn't have that little dot, so we say hevel. That's just so we're not confused about why does he keep pronouncing the B like a V. In Hebrew, it sounds hevel hevelim, kol hevelim. That's the theme here. So the question we have to grapple with right at the beginning, what does he mean? What do you think? What comes to your mind when you read that? Vanity of vanities, or does anybody have a different translation that says something other than vanity of vanities? So tell me what kind of sense is behind the Amharic word that they use there? Is it vanity, futility, meaninglessness? What's the sense? Meaningless? Okay. There are lots of nuances. What is surprising is this word, later I have how many times it occurs. There's a footnote later. It's interesting. It occurs 37 times, which there's a way of, one way of Jewish exegesis is called numerology, assigning numbers to letters. And it's the same thing that shows up sometimes in Revelation, where you can calculate the number of a word. Hevel occurs 37 times, which is exactly the Hebrew numerical significance of the word hevel. It's carefully structured. It's all throughout the book. But here's the challenge. Nobody knows exactly what it means. In other places in the Old Testament, other places in Hebrew, it appears to mean breath. So some translations will say, English translations will say, breath, merest breath. The problem is nowhere in the Old Testament is it used in a way that's not metaphorical. It's always a metaphor for something. So it's hard to wrap your mind around what exactly is he saying. So some translations go, it sounds like that's what the Amharic does, with more the meaningless aspect. And that's part of what he means. Others, like vanity in English has some of that sense, something that's meaningless or pointless. Futility is another translation that sometimes English words or English editions will use. But rather than being confused and saying, all right from the beginning, by verse 2, we have something that we can't answer, Kohelet is going to tell us what he means by hevel as he goes through this book. He's going to use this word repeatedly. It's going to be his key word for describing what it's like to live life under the sun. So if you were to ask him, if we could have him sitting here and say, after we say, who are you? So we can answer that question. If we say, now, what do you mean by this word? He'd say, read my book. I told you what I meant by it, by all the ways I describe and observe the word and tell you, this also is hevel. This also is vanity or meaningless or pointless or futile. This also is breath. We're going to see what he means by that. If we have to pick sort of a basic meaning, it seems to be something that you can't grasp. That's where breath actually comes close to where you think of how James describes life as a vapor, a breath. He's saying what he wants us to think about life is it's like something that you cannot get in your hands. You can't understand it, you can't comprehend it, you can't hold on to it. It is hevel. And he's going to grapple with seeing the world that way. He's going to teach us to begin to see the world that way. So here's the theme, and it's going to be repeated at the end. As we close the book, 12, I think it's 7 or 8, we'll repeat this theme almost directly. And then throughout, he's going to say, this too is hevel. This too, sometimes he'll add a phrase, this too is hevel and a chasing after the wind, a running after the wind, or this is futile, this is a sowing the wind. There's no point to this. He's going to teach us to think of life like that. Now, that might, even as we say it, that might be challenging. Like, isn't there a purpose to life? And yes, he's not simply saying life is meaningless, give up. He's much more complex than that. We have to let him walk us through. But that's our theme, vanity of vanities, hevel hevelim. And then he moves on and he gives there's a poem. Someone read for us verses 3 through 11. And let's think about as it sets us up with a poem. And it's going to alternate between poetry, proverb, narrative. But someone read that section and let's talk about what he's trying to teach us here. So that's the poem that begins this section. You notice when we get to verse 12, the next verse, we start the direct observation in first-person language. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. But this thing, after the theme in verse 2, we have this lengthy meditation. What's the point? What's he saying? If you had to summarize it or things that stand out to you, what is he intending for us to think about from this opening? Right. What's the significance of the descriptions of the sun, the wind, the streams? What's he saying with those images? Now, that's going to raise a question. Is he sort of this Eastern, all things just go, it's one great story? Is that what he's saying? You're shaking your head, which is right. But he is pointing to one aspect, and he's wanting us to think about there is something cyclical. Look at the way it ends. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after. What do you think he's saying there? Actually, let me put it in a question. I'll come back, but this might drive it home. How many of you know your great-great-grandfather's name? How many of you know details about his life? What he did, what he gave his life to, what was important to him? How about your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather? You're much farther back than any American can do. We don't value generations in the way that Ethiopian culture does. But if we don't have to push it very far to find a limit to where I know he was there. I might know his name. I can tell you things about my grandfather, and I actually can't tell you much beyond that because I don't think my dad knows anything about his great-grandfather. I can't go very far back, but you don't have to push far back before you realize people who lived and breathed and loved and worked and toiled like us have disappeared from the scene. Yeah, it's pointless. Give up. That's a great question to have because that is exactly what he wants you to feel. But that's not the end of the story. So as we work through it, what we're going to see is he wants you to have that feeling. Wait a minute. What is the point? What's the point of life? Because there are many false points of life that in the end will disappoint you and leave you bitter and cynical. And Ecclesiastes is the book that protects you from spending your life on something that you thought was going to matter and last forever and finding out that it didn't and being broken and cynical and bitter at the end. But along the way, it's actually the book that perhaps more than any other book in the Old Testament commends marriage and joy and feasting and eating and working. It's hard to fit him into any category. So from what we've read here, we should be thinking, wait a minute, what's the point of being a pastor? What's the point of marriage? What's the point of parenting? What's the point of church planting? What has been done will be done again. That's not the end of the story, but that's not an untrue observation. I'll just throw this out as a pastoral ministry example. Better pastors than I am, far better pastors than I am, have started churches and given their life to churches that now deny the gospel. You know the person I'm thinking of most directly? Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards labored in a church that now, it's still there, and still a church, and they deny everything that Edwards held dear. That fits in the, is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new. It has already been done in the ages to come. It is not possible to build something that will last forever in this world. And if our point in ministry is to think, well, Edwards missed it, go down the list of all the people who missed it, I'm going to be the one who finally builds the church that cannot fail and preaches in a way that always brings results, we'll be disappointed in the end. Better pastors than me, better parents than me, better fathers and husbands than me have given their lives faithfully, and in this world have seen all that they give their life to waste away. Ecclesiastes wants us to look at that clearly, not so that we become skeptical, not so that we decide it's not worth it, but so that we build on the right foundation. Does that make sense? But what you're feeling, Faisal, is what we should be feeling at this point. And remember the octopus picture, just when if you were ready to think, he's just a pessimist, he believes nothing matters at all, then he will turn around and say, I commend to you joy. Be happy in this kind of world. Or when we think he's telling us there's no point to work, he will turn around and say, put your hand to work at what you find to do with all of your might while you are living. Better to be living and working than a dead dog. Whenever we think we've got him figured out, there's going to be a place where he surprises us. And that's a gift to us because he's helping us to think rightly about life. Yeah, there'd be a way of reading this, especially that under the sun theme of thinking there's no significance to anything that happens in this world, just give up on it and become the sort of Gnostic or ascetic, someone who gives up, denies themselves the things of the Lord or the things of the world. And that's reading part of Ecclesiastes and then stepping off before he finishes where he wants to take us. That's where it's hard to put him into a box because there are things he'll say that sound like, yeah, there's no point to life. And then he'll turn right around and say, here's a point to life. Here's something you can do. And that surprise is a gift to us. We'll see that begin to unfold. But I'll flag it here and we'll come back to it. I think the under the sun is less a description of the material world in contrast to the immaterial world. It's a description of the age we live in under Adam. So I'm giving away what we're going to say, but it's important enough that we'll say it multiple times. In the context of the canon, I think what Ecclesiastes is describing is life in a world that is groaning under the burden of futility. That will not be the end of the story, but that is part of the story. And we will be disappointed and cynical and vulnerable to Satan's temptations that God has let us down if we think something we can do now will remove that groaning, remove that burden, and bring us to the glory of the freedom of the sons of God, to use Romans 8 language. So rather than being a material versus immaterial contrast, it's under God's judgment for human sin versus when God removes that and something really new is finally done. But Ecclesiastes won't let you think it's within my power if I am wise enough, wealthy enough, that's where we'll get in a minute, if I am work hard enough, there's nothing I can do to make that newness come under the sun. It's not within my power, and that glory has not been given to me. There is someone who can lift that curse and make something truly new take place. But it's not us. And the gift of Ecclesiastes is to pastors is to protect us from thinking that there's a way we can do ministry, a way we can live our lives that lifts that judgment of futility from the world. We can't. We live in that world, and yet there is meaning to this world. We'll get to it, but we're not the ones who can escape the judgment. Does that make sense? I'll say this again, and we'll talk about it either at the end of the day today or tomorrow. I think for pastors, one of the gifts of Ecclesiastes is it moves us from this path as we read it and wrestle with it. When you're first starting out in ministry, I say this was, even without realizing I was doing it, here was my thought. My ministry matters, subtext, because it's my ministry, and I'm going to do it right. As you read Ecclesiastes, even from the front, it's going to knock that down and say, there's nothing new under the sun. If you think the point of ministry is because you're going to be the one who does something new, something different, then Ecclesiastes is going to knock you down to the point where you think nothing matters. It's as though we begin with a temptation to pride that says, I matter. And then Ecclesiastes knocks our legs out from under us and says, no, if you think that, nothing matters. But by the end, it's going to say everything matters, but for a different reason than we thought at the start. And that change in reason why we think everything matters is so important. It's important for pastors. It's important for us as we follow Jesus. Let's do this. Let's keep moving so that we can work our way through as much of the text as we can. We're in, from the beginning of, after we have this theme in verse 2, we're in an observation complex. That's the term that guy uses. I was trying to come up with a better phrase because that sounds kind of clunky. But thinking of the unit that goes, you see it listed there in the text, from 3:4 to 4:16, it's all making observations. That's what he means by an observation complex. It's a Kohelet putting together lots of different observations that are marked by things like verse 13. I applied my heart to seek and search out wisdom under all that is done under heaven. Then he'll say, I said in my heart. I said in my heart, 2:1. I turned to consider, 2:12. He's going to give us observations that he has learned along the way. Some of those you'll read and think, that resonates with me. I understand the truth of that. Others you'll think, that challenges me. I thought something different about life. And he is knocking out all the false supports to move us to that place where we believe everything matters. Look in verse 13. There's a key theme that we see here for the first time. And I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. What do you think about that? How does that land on you? That sound like a happy verse that you're going to put on a coffee mug or put on a bumper sticker or put it on your t-shirt? I've never met anybody who did that. How's that land on you? What do you think he's saying? The key theme that I want you to look at there, he's observing the futility of things and his conclusion that this is an unhappy business. Or another way to translate that might be, this is a grievous business. It is heavy. It is painful, what has been given to us. But the key theme is that God has given this to the children of man. Why do you think God would do that? Does that sound like the way we think about God giving things to human beings? In light of a biblical theology, creation, fall, redemption, when would we put that gift of God? Right. It is a judgment, and that judgment serves a function that is not just judgment, but to point us to a salvation. It takes away from us places where we'd be vulnerable to look for false saviors. But because if this is true, if this is what God has imposed upon creation as a judgment for sin, then, think of Psalm 146, there is no son of man who can escape this. There's no B'nai Adam, no man whose breath can depart and return to dust who can get us out from this. Does that make sense? What I want you to remember, though, is that idea of gift, because here's what's significant. This isn't the only way that Kohelet will speak about God's gift to man, but it is very significant that it is the first place. He's going to describe other gifts that God gives, gifts that are good gifts, but you cannot get to those without accepting this and recognizing the rightness of God's judgment of futility on a world that rebelled against him. Tracking with me on that? All right, let's turn, because we can't look at all of this. A key section of this book is chapter 3. Someone read for us, so there's two parts I want us to read here. The poem from 1 to 8. So someone read that section, and then 9 to 15. All right, so this is a key passage in Ecclesiastes. One of the ways that's signaled is we break into poetry again and have a very famous poem. American Christians love to take parts of this and stick it on coffee mugs, things to hang up in their house. It drives me crazy because it's never, it's always a time to weep and a time to laugh. It's never a time to kill. No one puts that on a coffee mug. It's always a section of it, and no one ever thinks about how it fits in the context. And that's missing part of the message. But how does it land on you? What do you think is the point of the poem, and how does it relate to that description and observation that comes afterwards? Do you see links between those? What's the link showing that the second part we read is commenting on the first part? Look carefully. Are there repeated words in both sections that link them together? which both includes that key word time and also is somewhat of a restatement for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. So you see that? If you had to give a summary, what's the poem about? What's the word that's most repeated? Time. Now then, what do you think he's saying about time? What does he want us to think about? You know, not just time isn't measuring 60 seconds, but time, a season, a quality of a portion of our life. What's he saying about it? Yeah, so he's describing these times. There is an appropriate time for everything. For everything there is a season. God has made everything beautiful in its time. However, here's the next question. In light of what he says in both sections, is that something that human beings are in control of or something that only God knows? And in light of what he says at the beginning and in verse 11, God has made everything beautiful in its time, but does that mean that we're in control of it and understand how all those times work? No. Where in the second half does he tell us? Well, yeah, someone read verse 11 again. Tell us how this relates to the poem. Think about that. First, what's the difference between man and the animals? What has God given to us in this verse that sets us apart? Yeah, eternity. He has eternity into the hearts of men. That means we are the creatures who are going to try to figure this out. But are we going to be able to figure it out? These times, this description of life. What does he say? Yet so that what? We can't find it out. There's a way of reading this poem, and especially if you make a coffee mug out of the part that you really like, that makes it sound like, all right, if we just have the poem or the right point, we're kind of in control of which time do I want to be in now. I think Brian is right. It is a general description of all of life. And verse 11 says, yes, human beings are, because we are made in the image of God, we know there's more. Animals don't have questions about what season am I in? What's the time? What's the meaning of my life? Animals don't grapple with those questions. That's a distinction about the image of God. Yet just because we have that eternity in our hearts, the knowledge that there is something more, does not mean that we will have God-like understanding of it. In fact, God has designed the times so that we cannot find out. Now, in the text itself, why does God do that? Look where, especially in that description, the part 9 through 15, what is a reason given for why God does all this? God has designed the world in such a way that humans, we know there is more, yet we will never figure it out from God's perspective, so that we would fear before God. In other words, so that we would acknowledge God is God and I am not. Does that make sense? That's how this second section interprets and explains the meaning of the poem in a way that takes it in a very different direction from the coffee mug version, in which we're talking about how we like this time, we like these times, we're in control of these times. No. This is the description of the whole scope of human life, which will include a time to be born and a time to die. It will include weeping and laughing. It will include things that, I think one of my favorites is verse 5. There will be times when you are gathering stones, and there will be times when you are throwing away stones. No commentator gives a completely adequate explanation of what is meant by picking up and throwing down stones. I think the best description is it's a picture of the way that even our work is often pointless. One day you'll be building something up, the next day you'll have to tear it down. One day your job will be to gather up all the stones, the next day it'll be to take them and throw them somewhere else. You're not in control of it. There is a back and forth and a cyclical nature, a over and over streams running into the sea kind of language from chapter 1 that you cannot escape. God has designed it that way, and He has done that so that we acknowledge Him as God. Does that make sense? Now, here's a key question though. There'd be a way of saying all that where you and I could say, all right, close your laptops, let's go home, this is pointless. Is that what he says we should be doing? Even in the passage, what does he say? What's the application, if you will, of this little sermon he's given us? What are we supposed to do? And why? Where does that come from? So remember what we said, the first use of the gift theme. This is a prominent theme in Ecclesiastes. The first use of it is that statement in chapter 1. I think it's verse 13. God has given a grievous, a heavy evil a heavy burden for men to be busy with. You must accept that. If we rebel against that, we'll spend our days trying to find meaning under the sun where it's not there. But when we accept that, or to use chapter 3 language, when we fear and submit before God, here are the other gifts God gives us. The blessing of joy and peace and good ordinary gifts, the gifts of creation in the midst of a fallen and broken world. You see what I mean about you can't peg Kohelet as being either pessimistic or optimistic? He's hard to figure out, isn't he? But think of see if this seems to be a good summary of what we've said so far. You and I are creatures. We are not the creator. And if we spend our lives rebelling, trying to have creator-like knowledge of and control over our times, we will be endlessly disappointed and endlessly frustrated, and we will experience a grievous evil. But when we accept that we are creatures of a good God, we receive the goodness of being His creature. Does that make sense? That seem like a fair summary of where we're at so far? Even if we stop right now, you can't easily say whether Ecclesiastes is pessimistic or optimistic, can you? He's both pessimistic about human capabilities and yet joyful about what God gives when we accept those human limits. And he's not done yet. He's going to keep unfolding that. But that's going to be a key theme that keeps emerging. So thoughts or questions at this point? We've covered a lot of major themes. We can go a little faster in some of the other sections, but yeah, great question. We kind of skipped over that section, but chapter 2 is where he describes, in effect, as king, I had the capacity to pursue pleasure like no one else. I heaped up all the things that men can delight in, and I concluded this too was vanity. And then yet here he says, find pleasure, find joy. After saying pleasure is hevel, he says, seek pleasure and joy. How do we hold those together? I think the answer is this. If you seek joy and pleasure as the way to escape a hevel world, to escape the judgment of God imposed upon this world, it will prove vain. But when we obey the command, the implicit command of 3:14, we fear before God, we acknowledge that He is God, then we're in the place to receive pleasure not as an alternative to God, but as a gift from Him that He sustains us on as we live in a world under His judgment. See that distinction? It's probably more of a feature of American society is so given to entertainment. But I think it's becoming a universal thing because technology, makes it very easy to be entertained. You will meet people who use seeking pleasure. That is the goal of their life. And what chapter 2 is saying is, no matter how long you run after that, it will disappoint you. Let's speak directly, if sexual pleasure and sexual fulfillment is the end of your life, it will eventually pass and you will die, and it will leave you bitter and hopeless in the end. If wealth or anything else, any way that you can entertain yourself, even just sitting down and watching YouTube until your eyes bleed, any way you seek to find escape from this world, a replacement for God in joy or pleasure or toil, it will disappoint you. But when you recognize God is God and recognize He is in control of a world that we are not in control of, we're in a position then to receive the good gifts of God for what they're meant to be. Not a replacement for God, but a kind provision of the Lord that makes us look to Him as the ultimate provider and lets us enjoy them. This gift theme is so important. One of the things he'll say by the time we get to chapter 6, he said, I see something else under the sun. A man to whom the Lord has given wealth and possessions and power, and yet not the ability to enjoy them. And he says, this too is hevel. The point is, through this book, he is telling you, how is it that God gives you the gift of enjoying what you have? It's by submitting to God. And even that is a gift of God. So that in the end, we do really delight in the gifts of God. It is appropriate to find a God-given joy in enjoying good food, good fellowship, ordinary gifts of creation. Yet we do that not separating them from the Creator, but acknowledging they're from His hand and seeing Him as the one who gives even the power to enjoy them. That too is a gift of God. So just a practical way that theme has affected me as a preacher. Preparing a sermon is hard work. You know that. You wore yourself out over the last 24 hours doing that. There are times when I wake up as Sunday gets closer and think, I don't know if I would rather find something else to do today. It's going to be a hard day, and especially you'll have this experience as a preacher where you, at the start of the week, you think, I know what this passage says. And by Friday, you think, I know less about this passage than when I started. And Sunday is even closer. And now I'm more ignorant than I was when I started studying it. You'll be tempted to escape. One of the things I do when I come to that, when God is reminding me, is I say, Lord, it's going to be a day of hard work. Give me the power to enjoy the toil. Give me the ability to enjoy the work I've got to do today. Not connecting it saying, I want to work hard so that people tell me how good my sermon was. That's a false source of meaning. Rather, Lord, today I have the job of working hard at preparing the sermon. One day there'll be some preacher who works hard at preparing the sermon and the Lord comes back before he gets to deliver the sermon. Or I might work really hard on Friday and die on Saturday. The reason I'm supposed to work hard is not because I will get rewards or bear fruit on Sunday. On Friday, my reason for working hard is because the Lord has called me to do that. And I pray, Lord, give me the gift to enjoy today's hard work. And then when I get home, one of the ways this serves my soul is when I've worked hard and it's time to go home and laugh with my kids and do something silly and that appears to have no purpose, then I'm ready to say, Lord, now it's time to just laugh and wrestle on the floor because this too is a gift from you. I can't do that if I spent the day avoiding what I'm supposed to do and not working hard and then panicking at the end of the day, Sunday's coming. When I receive from the Lord's hands, okay, now is the time to work hard. Lord, help me to enjoy even the toil of working hard. And now when I put it aside, Lord, help me to go enjoy the gift of food and laughter with my family. Then I can receive it from his hand and find meaning in it, not because I know Sunday is going to bear much fruit. The word will always bear fruit, but I'm not guaranteed that I will see Sunday. There's purpose in Friday. Do you see what I'm saying? There's purpose in Friday's work because God said that's today's work. And when it's time not to do that, there is a God-given receiving of the gifts of joy that he gives me. And then I wake up the next day, if he gives me another day, and do it again. That's receiving the gifts of God in a way that honors God, that finds our ultimate meaning in God, and obeys where the book is going to end. Fear God and keep his commandments. That's what you're supposed to do. And that's a happy thing to do. That's not a burden that he lays upon us. That is the gift of finding our place in God's world. To be a servant of this God is a happy place. To try to escape his yoke and find meaning somewhere else will ultimately disappoint you. And so Ecclesiastes is a gift to us because it protects us from the kind of cynicism, pessimism, brokenness that comes if you spend your whole life thinking there's some other reason for obeying. And at the end discover, well, that could be taken away from me. I referenced Jonathan Edwards earlier. You know, how is his church today, even though he gave his life to his church, it's today not preaching the gospel. He was fired from that church. I don't know if you know the history of Jonathan Edwards, the man who preached sermons starting a major revival in America, was fired by the church where he preached and started a revival that's still in history books. Someone commented about him after he left that he appeared to be someone whose happiness was beyond the reach of his enemies. Because, I'm sure he didn't do it perfectly, but as someone who studied the word of the Lord, there was a sense in which he could say, the point of all I was doing was not to guarantee that my church would love me forever and would last forever as a faithful church. The point of preaching those sermons was because that was what God called me to do. And when, in the mystery of a hevel vanity world, those same people turned around and fired me and kicked me out, I can still be happy because my happiness is with God and is a gift from him, not in the ministry I'm doing. It's a challenging picture. One of the most awkward things about that is they fired him and then they couldn't find anybody to replace him. So they asked him to preach at the church for about 6 more months. And he did it, which says something about his humility to be able to say, to not be bitter against them and preach for the people who fired him and who were waiting for somebody they thought would do a better job but couldn't find anyone. So they kept him around for 6 months while they waited for somebody to fill his pulpit. I think that description, his happiness was beyond the reach of his enemies, is part of what Ecclesiastes is saying. Our happiness, our sense of meaning is beyond the reach of our enemies, and it's beyond the reach of a broken, futile world to take it away from us because we receive it from God, not from finding meaning in our toil apart from God. Does that make sense? You see when we receive this, what a burden-lifting book this can be. It's a crushing burden to think it's my toil that guarantees the meaning of my effort. It is freeing to say, Lord, I will work hard because that's what you've called me to do. And then I will rest because that's what you've called me to do. And as many days as you give me, that's what I'll do. And I know they will bear fruit forever. We'll talk about that because in the Lord our work is not in vain. But we're not looking to find that meaning here completely in a full sense, because there will be things that even at the end of our life won't make sense. And if we're looking for them all to make sense in this life, we'll be disappointed. One of the things that if you were to develop a theology of God from Ecclesiastes, one of the main emphases is that God is sovereign. He is in control. And if we spend our life trying to control the things that God has said we can't control, we will be frustrated. But if we accept that, we can receive the good gifts of a sovereign God who generously provides us what we need to be joyful, happy people each day. But it requires submission to the sovereignty of God. There's it's a parable or a proverb, I think it's in chapter 7, where he uses the image, he says, what God has made crooked, no man can straighten. Which is almost the reverse of what you'd expect, isn't it? God's the one who straightens things and men bend them. That's part of the truth. But there is also a truth that God has made a world that you and I can't figure out. We will never be able to straighten what God has made crooked. And we must submit to that and accept it. One of the illustrations I thought of with Ecclesiastes, the way it reveals our hearts, it's kind of like if, for instance, someone who we knew to be very, very smart came into the room and said, here, I have a riddle that is the most difficult riddle in the world. No one can solve it. And then he leaves the riddle there and leaves. It would test all of our hearts whether we really believe him that it's impossible or whether we think, I bet I can solve it. Let me have a crack at it. And if it really is something composed by the most wise person in the whole world that no human being can solve, we will be frustrated and we will reveal the arrogance of our hearts. Ecclesiastes says life is like that. Under the sun, under the judgment of Hevel, life is an enigma that you and I cannot figure out. And if we hear God say that and then say, well, God, I've read a couple books. I think I can figure it out. We will be frustrated forever. But if we can leave it there and say, you know what? I don't have to solve that riddle because God knows how everything is beautiful in its time. And he has promised one day it will be. So I'll leave the riddle in the hands of the Lord, and I'll live as the person who submits to the Lord's sovereignty and his goodness. Then we can find peace and contentment. Ecclesiastes speaks regularly about wisdom and the wise. And he does so in ways that are surprising after reading Proverbs. He'll say things like, don't be too wise. It's a challenge if we think what he means is a contradiction to Proverbs. But if you read him as the person who says, Proverbs is too simplistic, don't go down that road, then he'll turn around and say, it's better to be wise than a fool, because the wise have eyes in their head. They see where they're going. The fools are just walking in darkness. He's speaking about the same thing, but what we'll see is we'll look at one of those places because it's a key theme. He is relativizing wisdom. In other words, he's saying, if you read Proverbs and think that Proverbs will give you the kind of wisdom that actually lets you be the one who does something new under the sun, you be the one who escapes the judgment of Hevel imposed upon the world, you the one who can straighten what has been made crooked, then you have the wrong understanding of wisdom. You can read Proverbs and have an optimistic view of yourself, and he is tearing that down. But then he'll turn right around and say, no, it's better to be wise. But part of wisdom is recognizing the limits of wisdom. The wisdom God gives us is not wisdom meant to make us like God. It is wisdom to make us wise creatures of the all-wise God. And if we take it as the way that we can build a Babel-like tower and become like God, that is a foolish use of wisdom. And Ecclesiastes is the book that knocks that tower down. But it's not because he's against wisdom. It's because he said part of wisdom is knowing the limits of wisdom. So good question. They're in conversation with each other. And they're all describing the gift of wisdom that the people of God are to pursue, but they're helping us from different ways think about that wisdom rightly. Does that make sense? I think ultimately, yes, Ecclesiastes says it is all the sovereignty of God. And yet, this judgment of Hevel or futility that is placed upon the world, we'll talk about that in light of Romans 8, I think implies that there are things that happen that are pointless, but pointless things have a point. The point is to remind us that we are not God. But if we take the sovereignty of God to mean if I read my Bible enough, I can explain everything I see and everything that happens to me, then we'll be frustrated. Hevel means there are things that humans will never understand. To use that example I gave earlier, I don't think there is a human answer to the riddle of how the man who wrote 50 Fruits of Pride could be destroyed by pride. I can't figure that out. It is under the sovereignty of God, but it is a mystery that I cannot solve. It is ultimately the hand of God, but my task is not to think, well, if I understand the sovereignty of God well enough, I can make an explanation for it. From a human perspective, it is hevel. It is purposeless. There is a purpose to purposelessness. It is to remind me that I'm not the one who sees the end from the beginning and makes all things new. I don't know to what extent God will reveal all the counsels of his wisdom in eternity. I think we'll see much more. That will be part of our praise, to say, oh, what a marvelous thing the Lord has done. We'll never have an infinite mind and infinite wisdom, though I think there will always be a reminder, God is God and I am not. But in heaven, that will bring us to everlasting worship. This side of the final judgment and the revealing of all things, there are things that from a human perspective are purposeless. And the purpose of that, God imposing that upon creation, is so that we submit before him. Does that make sense? That's important because in suffering, one of the challenges we will have is to try to find a purpose for it that explains it and makes it make sense. And as we said earlier, when it's suffering that is a discipline for our sin, there is an immediate purpose that we're supposed to figure out. But that's not a complicated thing. That's not, Ecclesiastes isn't describing that kind of suffering, that kind of heavy burden. When that's the reason, we ask God, search me and know me, and he will search us and know us and convict us. There's another kind of experience of this hevel life that you will never figure out, but you'll be tempted to in suffering, and it will, both you and people you counsel will be, you will be kept up at night thinking, if I could just figure this out, it would go away. And the point is not to figure it out, it's to submit to the Lord and then receive the way he cares for us in the midst of that kind of world. So that's a key point. It's one of the reasons, Ecclesiastes is so important, especially for pastors.